Bertrand Russell's book, The Conquest of Happiness, is a book about happiness, but with some caveats. Now, if you're familiar with Russell, then you'll know that some of his books are technical and some of his books are not technical. This book is a not so technical book. The preface, or like the introduction to the book, says that Russell was asked to write books about ordinary life during his time. I think it was published in like 1932. And in doing so, he thought about, well, what causes unhappiness in modern societies? Now, I preface modern societies here because Russell is not saying that money buys happiness. When he says modern societies, he quite literally means it. He excludes any societies where obviously there's famine, poverty, high Gini coefficient or high wealth inequality. He excludes these things, and he's only focusing on the kinds of unhappiness that you would experience inside a modern society. One that isn't caused by famine, ill health, or any kind of extreme like war, any kind of extreme outward condition. Now, there are two sections to this book. There's one section that is called the causes of unhappiness, and then there's another section that deals with the causes of happiness. We're going to start with the causes of unhappiness. So in the beginning, in the first part of this section of the causes of unhappiness, Russell has this chapter called What Makes People Unhappy. And the start of this chapter starts off with Russell giving accounts of his own life, which actually shocked me, but kind of makes sense given how the kind of person that I understand Russell to be. And his account of his early life experiences was that he was unhappy, he was bored, on the verge of committing suicide in his own words. I think he said suicidal. And what got him out of that rut was a diminishment of the preoccupation with himself. Now, you might be wondering why a diminishment with the preoccupation of yourself, basically focusing on yourself, why no longer focusing on yourself, why focusing on yourself so long would cause unhappiness. Or the inverse of this, which is that you're no longer focusing on yourself and so therefore you're a little bit more happy. Russell gives two reasons. He says on the one hand, focusing on yourself is like a stagnant thing. It's just you're looking at this one little ball of existence or this one little entity that doesn't make progress, it doesn't change over time. Why doesn't it change over time? Because you're not focused on anything else but yourself, right? So you can't change. You're constantly focused on the same exact thing over time, and humans get a satisfaction from a sense of progress. So there's one reason. The other reason is because when we look at ourselves all the time and we see no progress, but just in general when we look at ourselves, we critique ourselves. Our own selfhood is one of the only things that we critique quite a lot, that we admonish quite a lot. We critique it, condemn it, we complain about it. Whereas if you look at, say, like a flower, we don't really critique a flower for the way that it grows. If a flower fails to entertain us, we don't really critique the flower, we just kind of accept the state of affairs. And then on the other hand, when you're looking on things outside yourself, you're going to make progress. So rather than critiquing yourself all the time, you'll be making progress towards something, which might actually make you want to congratulate yourself. Basically, these two reasons are the reasons why Russell says that self-absorption, or looking at yourself too much, can cause unhappiness. Now, from that, Russell goes into this kind of traditional Russell thing, which is to break things down into categories. He loves to do this. He did this in his book that I just read, Power, the New Social Analysis. This is kind of like a little thing that Russell does all the time, and I actually like it. It's quite creative, I think. It's analytical and creative. He breaks down these types of self-absorption, we'll call it. This is the word he uses. He breaks them down into three different types. You have the sinner, you have the narcissist, and the megalomaniac. We'll explain all three of these in turn. So the first one is the sinner, and the sinner is not necessarily religious. The name obviously kind of makes you think it's religious, but it's not necessarily religious. The sinner is simply someone who is lost in the consciousness of sin. Now, there are obviously two types of sinners. Russell has this religious sinner who he says basically condemns themselves so that they can live up to the standards of their God or of their religion. And this is kind of like a kind of sinner who lives in the consciousness of being persecuted by others or by their figure of belief, or even just other members of the church. That's one type of sinner. But the other type of sinner is someone who is a more secular sinner, someone who's stuck in the consciousness of sin, but in this case, rather than the rules and morals and standards that you're using to make yourself an evil person or a sinful person, being religious ones, in this case, they're secular ones. So you could think of internalized standards that you get from society, such as standards about modesty, standards about eating, if you can be a gluttonous eater, overspending, if you're obviously someone who spends too much and don't follow a budget. In modern society, we would say it's a bad thing to break your budget routinely. We would say it's a bad thing, and since we say it's a bad thing, that can be used to be applied to yourself and therefore make you kind of lost in this consciousness of sin. So that's one type of self-absorption. Another type of self-absorption is narcissism. Now, Russell clarifies that some levels of narcissism is healthy, sure, but when he talks about it, what he really means is in excess. So excess narcissism for Russell causes unhappiness in two ways. On the one hand, there's narcissism that basically wants you to get recognition from other people in your personal relationships. So if you're someone who wants recognition from someone else, Russell says what these people do is, once they get the recognition from another person, they lose interest in that person and then can't manifest genuine love. So let's say John wants recognition from Jane because he wants to be loved. John gets that recognition from Jane, but now that he knows he has that recognition, since he wants other people to recognize himself in the same way that he does, he needs recognition from others, and so he ignores Jane. And so he gets Jane's recognition, but then he doesn't manifest genuine love or a genuine relationship, because he's so obsessed with himself that he has to have everybody else be equally obsessed, and so he pursues other forms of recognition. The other way this kind of self-absorption makes people unhappy is by skills. So let's say you're an artist who develops a set of skills, and you kind of develop a little bit of a technique over time that gets you some recognition. Rather than manifesting your own style and kind of diving deeper into that style, you'll simply reproduce what gets you recognition, as Russell says. And as a result of that, you don't really develop a refined palette or like a refined taste or a unique aesthetic. You simply keep producing what gets you recognition. And you can see this even with like the modern music industry. People will prefer to make music that's more in line with the mainstream kind of bland taste, rather than make something unique and idiosyncratic that is more in line with their own taste, but might not get them as much recognition. These two types of forms of narcissism are just another, again, a self-absorption that causes us unhappiness, and we should avoid them. In fact, what Russell says about this is that human nature or instinct is much more diverse than this, and for us to have an enriched life, we desire more than recognition. Yes, we do desire some recognition, but he says something to the effect of like a hunter both wants to be appreciated for his hunting skills, but also to be able to appreciate his own ability to actually do the hunting, right? There's something about living in the process that also requires us to be able to appreciate life for us to be happy. The last type of self-absorption that Russell talked about was megalomania, or like a megalomaniac. Basically, these are people who love power to like an excessive extent. They're very rare people, and he gives the examples of like Alexander the Great, Caesar, you could even say Augustus was in there, Napoleon. These people were megalomaniacs, and they loved power so much that they only pursued furtherances of power. And this is a kind of self-interest because it's about your own power. You don't want just the power of your nation. You're talking about your personal power with inside of a nation or with inside of a corporation or whatever kind of power hierarchy you're in. You're always reflecting on your position of power and trying to increase it. It's basically pursuing power for power's sake, which Russell disagrees with entirely, and I would disagree with that as well. But that's another type of self-absorption that Russell talks about. So those are some of the things that he distinguished, and he does this little thing, like I said, like he breaks down a little concept like self-absorption into like distinct, more minute concepts. It's very fun and also analytical. And he obviously says that these are just excess examples. Some of self-absorption is necessary, but we need to have like a balance in order to have a healthy life. The next chapter that Russell deals with in the causes of unhappiness section is byronic unhappiness, which is really, really funny. I actually like this chapter a lot, and I'm very glad that this was in the book. Basically, byronic unhappiness is this intellectual unhappiness that seems to be like a illness of people who have too much time to think, or are just doing too much thinking, or maybe they're too educated. This is basically what you'll find when you spend too much time with philosophy students or literature students. They have this byronic unhappiness. Now let me explain more in detail what byronic unhappiness is. And what better way to explain than by example. So the first one I think comes from people who have studied naturalism or naturalist philosophy or just work in the natural sciences. Here is a kind of paraphrase of like the gist of this worldview, okay? The world does not have any meaning. It is simply like a set of cold and natural operating forces, and you are programmed by evolution to just procreate. And a failure to realize this is simply you just being dumb or like silly, and there's no meaning to any of these things that we're doing. It's just cold, mechanistic interactions. That's one form of byronic unhappiness. Another form of byronic unhappiness would be kind of what you see in archaeology, but even it's become quite the pop culture argument that humans were originally hunter-gatherers and we should only be hunter-gatherers. Modern society is a plague. It is an ill to human well-being. And rather than looking at any evidence of this, they simply just conclude that because we're no longer how we used to be, that therefore we are unhappy. It kind of romanticizes history, you could say. That's another form of byronic unhappiness. And two other ones are, one surprisingly, this shocked me, was stoicism. And another one could be, I don't know if you would call it fatalism. I'd have to look this up. But basically, there's a worldview where it's like, the universe is going to die from a heat death, so you putting things into the world doesn't matter anyways, because it's all going to be meaningless since it's all going to disappear at the end of the universe. Or you could say that like there's no addition or subtraction of fundamental particles, and so why bother with changing anything since it's all going to be the same in the grand spectrum of things. Just kind of like a weird take on physics or like thermodynamics to justify their own unhappiness. The stoicism one caught me a bit off guard, but I kind of agree with it actually, and I think it's a really good critique of stoicism. The stoicism one is to the effect of like, it's a solitary philosophy that ignores that humans are social creatures. So they say like reaching genuine human fulfillment is done through, I don't know, you could say discipline, accepting that life is suffering, basically that you're not guaranteed happiness and the happiness might not even come, but you should persevere anyways. They kind of push the recognition of human fulfillment into a solitary practice rather than the community practice, and Russell disagrees with that. So basically all these worldviews here, obviously if you've gone to a university setting, you've heard this more than probably a few times, and if you studied philosophy, you've probably heard it at least 100 times by now, right? These are common beliefs. Russell thinks they're mistaken philosophies because they're not grounded in like a general view of human enrichment, or you could say human nature. We're not solitary creatures, we're community-based creatures, so solitary philosophies are not really helpful here, such as stoicism. Obviously, he says there's no logical consequent or like necessary entailment to pessimism. He says there's no metaphysical causes for pessimism. So looking at all the natural sciences and then inferring all this stuff about how you should live your life, that's like a bit of like a non sequitur, you could say. It doesn't follow. He disagrees with all that. And I actually kind of agree with him on all of this. I think byronic unhappiness is actually kind of like a meme, and you should avoid it because there's no, unless you want to be unhappy, then you're. But like if you want to be happy, then the premises for these byronic unhappiness worldviews do not necessarily lead to the conclusion that you should be pessimistic. Now, the next section is titled like boredom and excitement, and is a cause of unhappiness. And it actually shocked me what he had to say about this. So that's just for like hitting your P's and Q's sake, talk about what he thinks boredom and excitement is. For him, boredom is two essential elements. It's the lack of preoccupation with mental faculties and a lack of favorable circumstances. And the opposite of boredom is excitement, and actually the definition is the opposite as well. So preoccupation with mental faculties and being in more favorable circumstances. Now with this definition of boredom, you might think it's like, oh, well, it's irrelevant, but it's actually relevant here because what he says is that as a society, we are more entertained now because of technology. We are actually not more bored, we are less bored, this is why it was counterintuitive to me. He says that technology has given us more things to do and it has made our circumstances more favorable, and I actually agree with him on that. However, this does cause a problem. Russell actually says we have a fear of boredom and that we are addicted to excitement. Because we're always excited, we know what it's like to be excited, and because the threshold for excitement is much lower now, we always pursue it rather than being bored. This can cause some problems. On top of that, he says that we no longer know how to be bored. We don't have to do this anymore. We also don't teach our children how to be bored. And my immediate thought was like, if Russell saw the iPads in the hands of children today, he would be like giddy, because he's right? Like we've done exactly what he was talking about in 1932. We now put like technology in front of children's faces, that basically is keeping them hyper entertained. This is not a good thing. On the one hand, boredom, if you know how to deal with it and tolerate it, can actually guide you to your quote-unquote true north in life. Basically, if you're bored, then you can actually think about, well, why am I bored? What's wrong with me right now? And maybe it's because you realize, well, I don't have any momentary entertainment, or because I'm not doing what I want in life. So boredom can be helpful in that way. But also, as Russell says, most meaningful things in life have to be done by being bored. If you can't tolerate boredom, then you can't tolerate a long-term relationship, right? Long-term relationships are going to have patches of boringness, right? They're not all going to be intense, romantic, and exciting relationships, at least not in every minute or hour of the day, okay? And maybe there'll even be weeks where there's no excitement. Developing skills. Anybody who wants to get really good at a particular set of skills has to entertain being bored. There are times where I'll read a book and I'm really bored at one section of the book. But in order for me to maintain the arguments, I need to get to the next section of the book. And so I need to read this boring part, right? Yeah, if I want to follow the arguments, I need to read the boring stuff. If you want to get good at painting, sometimes you're going to be doing boring stuff when you're painting. If you want to run a business, not all businesses grow super fast. Sometimes there is a 3-year period of slow but steady growth. And that's really boring, right? It's not as exciting as making a 35% return annually. So boredom is essential for all the meaningful things in life as well. And if we're not tolerating boredom, then we're not going to have happy lives. So it's actually not that we need more excitement, which I thought what he was going to say is you need to be more excited. It's that you need more boredom, which is the counterintuitive claim for this chapter. Now, the next chapter is envy. One of the causes of unhappiness is envy. And Russell has a great quote actually in this chapter. I'll put the full quote, but the ending of the quote is the success or happiness of others becomes a source of unhappiness and hatred for us. That's what envy does. Envy also has some other functions for Russell, and that quote's great now, but then the rest of the chapter deals with envy as a source of ungratefulness, envy as a source of false modesty, or basically false morals. And then it goes on to envy as harmful and necessary for democracy. That's interesting. I never thought I'd ever see anybody talk about envy being important for democracy, but you'll see what I mean. So envy as a form of false modesty or false morality comes as an example. He could talk about, I think he talks about some sheep or king or something like this. I'm just going to give my own example because I can't remember what he said. Basically imagine that you have a king who doesn't like that there are people around him who have better cheekbones, okay? And so what does he do? He makes a rule saying that for men to show their cheekbones is an immodest thing. And so he outlaws that. This is a rule that has now been put in place, motivated by envy. And so therefore it's not actually a moral thing, it is a thing stemming from envy. Some maybe more relevant examples might be discussion of personal finances at a dinner setting. If you're someone who has a lot of wealth in your personal finances and there's someone else around who doesn't, it's considered inappropriate to talk about your personal finances. But this might just be because of envy and not because of any moral reason, right? It could just be a standard that's put in place by envy, and therefore it is a false modesty or a false morality. Now, envy also plays a role in democracy, and it can be helpful in certain ways and harmful in others. He gives the example of the democratic suppression of wealth inequality. So there were obviously impoverished people who were envious of the wealthy, and so they sought out democratic means to basically redistribute or make more fair the game of wealth acquisition, okay? So there's one pro for envy in democracy. Another example might be equal rights. Obviously, if you're envious of the rights of another group of people, then you can democratically pursue getting equal rights. This is one role that envy plays in democracy. A negative can be when the envy becomes poisonous. So some people, let's say if you vote for one president and that president gets in, and then the next year the opposing party's candidate gets in, and you get bitter about that to the point where you just don't even want to participate in the democracy anymore. You can become envious of this. A society that has a diminishing religious influence, the religious people can become envious of the increasing influence of, say, a secular group, and so they can become bitter and basically unnecessarily partisan or like combative on certain issues. So envy can play both a harm and a detriment to democracy, which I thought was an interesting thing to say. And then I thought, well, how does that relate back to personal life? And he did say in the beginning of the book it was for modern societies or fully fledged societies that aren't plagued by famine or anything extreme. And so yeah, that actually is true. I would imagine that envy can play a massive role in democracy, which then can actually play a role in your own happiness. Now, I can't cover all the causes of unhappiness. There are some other chapters in there, but there are some honorable mentions I want to make here before going on to the next sections. One was competition, which I wholeheartedly agree with. It might be a bit obvious, but basically the idea that like everything should be competition, that every conscious moment of your life should be viewed from a competitive framework, that is as much a source of unhappiness as viewing as everything as a political thing, right? If you think everything is politics and that preoccupies everything in your mind, then you can't really kind of unplug or relax. Competition for competition's sake is what Russell said is not healthy, like it's not good. If you want to be happy, you need to get out of that kind of competitive mindset. If your friend gets a raise at a business that you're working at and you don't always have to do this as a competition. You could just be happy for that person's raise and be content with what you have. Another chapter was persecution mania, which I could not actually understand what it was about until I got into the chapter. The header it makes sense, but it's a bit, I don't know. Basically, he talks about how there is this mental health problem where people feel persecution, and in excess, it develops into like a clinical issue, maybe schizotypal or schizoid personality disorder. They feel like they're paranoid, right? Russell says in less success forms, people have it as well. So for example, if you're someone who always goes out of your way to do things for people, you might feel that if they don't appreciate you, that you're being persecuted, that there's something that like they don't like you. I just did this for them. Why aren't they saying thanks? How dare they? It's kind of like a persecution mania. Or he gave the example of an inventor who invents a product that doesn't sell well. Nobody really looks at it. And he goes, people are ungrateful, they're coming after me. Rather than taking the view that like your product just isn't good, you view it as someone is out to get you. Russell kind of gives this thing where he says people don't care about you that much, not everything is about you. Don't turn every single instance where you don't want to get like you basically don't get what you want. In those situations where you don't get what you want, don't turn it into also someone's personally coming after you to persecute you, right? That's what he means by persecution mania. And I think that's a really great idea, and we should all try to avoid that as much as possible. So now we can go into the causes of unhappiness. Wait, no, let me go back. Sorry, the causes of happiness. And the first chapter is called, Is Happiness Still Possible? So he starts this chapter off by making this distinction that I think it's John Stuart Mill makes it, or one of the Johns, not John Locke, is it John Locke? It might have been John Locke. I don't know, one of the Johns, okay? One of the philosophy Johns. That there is a higher pleasure and that there is a lower pleasure. But he says that it's like a pleasure of animal spirit and of brain, or maybe pleasure of instinct versus education, or of heart and brain. He kind of gives these kind of analogies. He doesn't really like technically define it. So the simpler pleasures or the lower pleasures would be like watching baseball, going for a walk, playing a game, something like this. Whereas the higher pleasures might be things done through reading and writing. So work of science, work of poetry, reading a book, writing a novel, or maybe writing a nonfiction book. Something like this would be what Russell means by higher pleasures. Things that can be done after the acquisition of some level of education. Basically, there's an educational barrier between you and the higher pleasure. That's kind of what he means. And in that chapter, he basically argues that we should have a balance between higher and lower pleasures. The second part of the book has a lot more interconnectivity, but basically, you'll see later on that the lower pleasures can also be important for like unplugging or like dealing with fatigue. So like watching a baseball game. Whereas the higher pleasures can give you a greater sense of gratification, make you prideful of yourself because you've stepped over some barrier to reach that pleasure. But also, higher pleasures tend to be respected more inside society. So a scientist and a poet and a writer might be more respected than, say, a janitor. Which is not to say there's no skill to being a janitor, but I'm going to argue that being a PhD in physics has a higher education barrier than being a janitor. It's just state of affairs. In society, people appreciate the scientist more than the janitor. Now, this next chapter that he deals with in the causes of happiness is zest. And the way he explains zest is by an analogy to food. He says, someone who finds food to be like a chore won't eat their food, they won't enjoy their food. Someone who eats food out of like a duty won't enjoy their food. Someone who eats too much food also won't really have an enjoyment of food. There is a healthy appetite towards not only food, but also a breadth of food as well. So one way Russell says that zest makes our life better is because someone who has an appetite for life is going to get more pleasure out of life. You could say that someone who has an appetite for risk will get more out of their stocks, right? You could say the same thing. Someone who actually has an eagerness to learn how to play the piano will only experience the pleasures of actually playing the piano. Someone who has the eagerness to go for a walk will only experience the pleasure to actually be derived from going for a walk. And in addition to that, if your zest is only for one specific thing, I mean, obviously there's going to be exceptions to the rule, but if your zest is for one specific thing and you're only a specialist and you're not a generalist about life, at least in some specific, in some ways, but you don't have to become an expert, but you can step outside your expertise, right? If you're a specialist, then you run the risk of basically becoming having too much knowledge on a specific topic to the point where you basically know everything. And there could be a lot of repetition, which could then maybe lead to some fatigue or some boredom of what you're doing, and that's also not a good thing. So having a general zest for life is better than having just a specific narrow zest. Obviously, there are exceptions to that rule, though. Now, Russell closes this chapter on zest with a little bit of a kind of recollection where he went for a walk somewhere in London with some graduate students, and he talks about how society beats the zest out of people. On this walk, he was like enjoying himself, and he thought, well, I'm going to ask about the flowers, because he was with a tour guide. And the tour guide said, well, actually, I don't know anything about the flowers. I just know the path that we're supposed to walk. And he thought that this was a great example of how the specialization of human abilities and skills, obviously from the division of labor, right, leads to a lack of a general excitement for other things in life because you don't know anything about it. There's no expertise on it. You have no general knowledge on it. You're too narrowly focused. And that actually kind of upset Russell. He said that he wanted to, like, while he was going on for a walk, just be curious about everything that was around him, not just the walk itself. And his tour guide had none of the knowledge. And he thought, well, wow, what a useless tour guide. That was his, I believe his paraphrasing him, I think that's what he said. So he cautions us that society is going to discourage us from a general interest in life. Now, Russell also talks about affection. And he says on the one hand that affection is just one of these things that humans do, and it's a joyful thing in general. Much of human history is filled with love of nation, love of king, love of knowledge, love of discovery, love of travel. There's so many things that we love to do, and we also are appreciative of receiving love from, right? We love a family member, we obviously want the love to be returned. So on the one hand, seeking out love is a good thing for humans because we just enjoy it. On the other hand, love can have this double-edged sword effect where someone who is loved can be more secure in who they are in life. Someone who has a support base at home might be more willing to take risks outside. Someone who has a support base at home might be more likely to stand up against oppressive social norms, right? Having love can secure us in who we are and therefore give us a greater zest for life. But there is a drawback to this, which is that if you receive a bad kind of love, he actually says timid love, not to be confused with timid used in his book of Power of Social Analysis. I guess it's not a technical term, it's a general term. Timid love can actually make you insecure, right? And if you're growing up with timid love, it can actually make you fearful of the world rather than being secure enough to actually go out and journey into the world, right? A good example would be like a mother who tries to protect their child too much, like a helicopter parent, and in doing so says that the world is filled with evils, is filled with things that want to harm you, and there is nothing great out there. It is a type of love. Sure, they obviously love the child, want to protect them, but it's a bad kind of love because it puts the wrong idea into this person's head, and it kind of does the opposite of what you want from love, which is that it doesn't put them in a good position to go outside, it puts them in a bad position to go outside. Now, in a similar sense, family, which is another chapter, can have the same kind of double-edged effect. And actually family has been changed as well due to democracy. Russell likes to bring democracy into a lot of things. Russell says on the one hand, if you have a family, then yes, you're more secure, just as if you would have more love. However, family has now faced a lot of new problems that were brought about by democracy. On the one hand, the roles of parents to children have changed in economic terms. Children now have more access to go and pursue other career paths. They don't just follow what their parents want. Parents can no longer punish their children in the same way because now children can afford to leave the house earlier. Children can also seek out their own kinds of education. The state wants you to send them to an institution, and at the end of that institution, they're allowed to go to whatever university they want to, right? And in replacement of this kind of economic control that parents used to have over their children, they've now added moral control. So when a child misbehaves in a certain way, rather than taking away any kind of access to the wealth, which historically they could do, they instead morally condemn them, and this leads to a lot of friction in the household, right? On top of this, you now have human rights and things like labor rights that have come into play. So now parents can't simply just put their children to work. They can't do that anymore. They can't kind of control them in that sense because now there's legal repercussions for doing so. On top of that, the children can also contact protective services if the parents are being abusive, so there's a limit to now how the parents can reprimand their children. And even now we have this kind of democratic intervention into parenting where beforehand parenting used to be between the parent and the child. Now it went to the parent, the church, and the child, and now it's actually to the point of the parent, the state, science, church, and the child, right? So there's more people involved in the parenting process. Not Freud, Russell gave the example of how Freudian psychology or psychoanalysis kind of made parents second guess their own strategies because they thought, well, am I going to manifest some kind of repressive behavior in my child if I do this? Basically, the dynamics of the family have been changed by democratization of the family. And basically, Russell views this as a good thing, right? Of course, we want people to have more equal rights. We obviously want people to have an opinion or a voice if you're pro-democracy. And so Russell views this as a source of happiness, but it can be a source of unhappiness if you do too much to the family structure at once to the point where it can't cope with it. So it can be a source of unhappiness as well. Now here are some honorable mentions for the causes of happiness. I didn't go over all the causes of happiness, but here are some honorable mentions. One is idleness. Obviously, this is a no-brainer. Don't be idle. Idleness can lead to a lot of bad things, and Russell gives tons of examples where idleness just leads to complete and utter ruin, okay? So just avoid being idle. That's a bit of a no-brainer. The other one, though, is a bit more interesting, which is disinterest. I don't think he uses that term, but basically, it's another term for disinterest. The idea here is that you can do something that you're not particularly interested in, but is enjoyable. So again, going back to previous examples from other chapters, watching a baseball game. Russell never really has particular interest in baseball, but by watching a baseball game, he can see that there's some fun to it, right? And in doing so, that gives him a greater proportion of who he is inside society, what role he fulfills, right? His disinterested takes, or his disinterested interests, you could say. It's kind of impersonal interest into baseball, gives him a better understanding of who he is. On top of that, he says that all meaningful work in life is going to get hard at some point. There's no such thing as meaningful work that is always easy. And so you do need an outlet to unplug, and having a disinterested thing, such as watching baseball or going for a walk, is a good way to cope with those struggles. It is a way to unplug and to relax and to avoid being over-fatigued. So having a hobby that you can follow or do anything really, doesn't even have to be a hobby, just picking one thing from a list of activities and going out and doing that thing in a disinterested way, a way that you're never going to take it seriously, just exploring what they do, right? Maybe an example for me is carpets or paintings. I know nothing about painting. I know nothing about how carpets are made, but I can appreciate the aesthetic of these things, right? I can just, in a disinterested way, go and appreciate it. And so that's another way to actually be happy. I think that's worth mentioning. So overall, my general reflections on the book are, it's actually surprisingly relevant for a book being published in 1932 or 1930. Almost 100 years ago. The book is still relevant and is still on topic, and In addition to this, like the explorations of the topics, like you might hear that, like for example, excitement and boredom is a general like self-help topic that needs to be discussed, but the way he explores it is not how you would see a modern writer explore the topic. And I think this is attributed to like Russell's development as a person. He has such a refined palette because of all the books he's read, all the books he's written, that his takes, even on ordinary subjects, are well worth reading, which is why I'm going to read all of his books. So it's still surprisingly relevant. I do agree with a lot of what he says inside the book. I actually don't find too much of it disagreeable. And there might be like one or two things here and there, but overall, like the advice is actually quite sound. It's quite solid. I might have thought of it at one point or another, but like him having all of it here in one little section is really, really good, even if some of the ideas are basic, right? Like don't be idle, for example. So for those reasons, I think the book is actually quite good. Now, if you're wondering if you should read the book or not, because I didn't cover all of it, there is, I would say yes, this is actually like one of these books that I would say is like an 8 out of 10 and is worth reading. If you're a Bertrand Russell fan, you should read this book. If you like to like study the philosophy of happiness or unhappiness, then I would say read this book. If you're someone who's looking for a self-help book, then I would say read this book. The only reason I would say you should not read this book is if you're already happy in life and like you're not really interested in like studying happiness, then this book isn't going to offer much for you, because especially if you're already someone who's delved into a lot of self-help literature, you might find some of the ideas that like, I've already discovered this, I've already read this, and so on and so forth. I personally read the book because I want to do a binge like stack on happiness, as you've probably seen in my other videos. But that's who I think should read this book. Those are your reasons. Overall, the book is a good like 8 out of 10. I didn't regret reading it, and I can confidently say that I walked away with some original takes on things like family structure and the relationship to democracy, even though I wasn't going in for such a take, right? But that's Russell. Overall, good book, and with that being said, bye bye.